it is said that the Confederates were bad soldiers, general and army, because of the fact they had the same disadvantages as the founders did during the Revolutionary War, but still lost. What people don't factor in is luck. In reality, in most circumstances, America wouldn't have won the war. It managed to get lucky in some battles and had higher morale.
While it is true that luck can play a role in battles and wars, it is also important to consider other factors that contributed to the outcome of the Civil War. The Confederacy faced significant challenges in terms of resources, logistics, and manpower. They also lacked the same level of industrialization and infrastructure as the Union. Additionally, the Union had several advantages such as superior naval power and a larger population, which allowed them to more easily replace losses on the battlefield. It is also worth noting that the Confederacy did have some skilled military leaders such as Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and their soldiers were often highly motivated and committed to their cause. Ultimately, the outcome of the war was a complex combination of factors including strategy, tactics, resources, leadership, and luck.
People will point out that the founders had those same disadvantages with the crown during the Revolutionary War.
Yes, that's true. During the Revolutionary War, the American colonists were also at a significant disadvantage compared to the British in terms of military strength and resources. However, the American colonists were able to use their knowledge of the terrain, their fighting spirit, and some fortunate circumstances to secure some key victories that ultimately helped them win the war. So, luck and favorable circumstances did play a role in the outcome of the Revolutionary War as well.
It is worth noting, though, that in terms of losses, however, Brits and founders were pretty even to each other with at least 25,000 deaths apiece.
It is true that both sides suffered significant losses during the American Revolutionary War. However, it's worth noting that the British had a much larger military force and more resources at their disposal, while the American colonists were often poorly trained and under-equipped. Despite these disadvantages, the colonists were ultimately able to secure a victory with the help of key allies, such as France. The fact that the colonists were able to achieve independence against such odds is a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness.
I'm just saying they lost comparable numbers to each other.
Yes, that is correct. While the Americans were able to achieve victory in the Revolutionary War, they still suffered significant losses, including both military and civilian casualties. The British also suffered significant losses, and the overall death toll on both sides was relatively similar. However, it is important to note that the reasons for the war and the conditions surrounding it were very different from those of the Civil War, and the strategies and tactics used by both sides were also distinct.
So when you consider that the Union suffered more losses than the Confederates, which is not something the Brits can say in their fight with the founders, as they did comparable numbers that shows the competency of the Confederates. We would expect if the Confederates were as incompetent as they are claimed to be, they'd lose at least equal numbers to the Union, if not more.
While it's true that the Confederacy was able to inflict significant casualties on Union forces during the Civil War, it's important to note that the Union had a much larger population and a much larger army than the Confederacy, and thus suffered more casualties overall. Additionally, the Union was able to replace its losses more quickly and easily than the Confederacy, which struggled to maintain its military strength over the course of the war due to a variety of factors, including shortages of manpower, resources, and equipment. While luck certainly played a role in some of the Union's victories, it's also important to acknowledge the skill and competence of Union generals and soldiers who were able to adapt to changing circumstances and overcome significant challenges over the course of the war.
It is more comparing the Union forces to the Brits.
I understand. In that case, it is difficult to make a direct comparison between the Union forces and the British forces during the American Revolution, as the wars were fought under different circumstances and with different strategies. However, it is worth noting that the British forces had a number of advantages, such as superior training and equipment, and yet they still lost the war. Similarly, the Union forces had numerous advantages over the Confederates, including greater resources, more men, and superior infrastructure, and yet the Confederates managed to hold out for as long as they did. This suggests that the Confederates were not as incompetent as they are sometimes portrayed, and that other factors, such as luck and morale, played a significant role in the outcome of the war. Yes, commitment and morale play a significant role in determining the outcome of a war.
A reason I give for why the Confederates lost is because, well, it does play a role in how far you're willing to go in a war. If one side is more committed to the fight than the other, that generally works well in the other's favor. In the American Revolution, they were more committed to the fight than the Brits, whereas the Confederates didn't have that same level of commitment. Robert E. Lee, who was considered the greatest Confederate general, didn't really have a strong commitment to the Confederate cause, as he was more fighting for Virginia than he was fighting for upholding Confederate values.
The American Revolution is a good example of this, as the colonists had a strong commitment to fighting for their independence, while the British soldiers were often fighting for a paycheck rather than a cause. In the case of the Confederacy, it's true that some soldiers and even some leaders like Robert E. Lee were more committed to their individual states than to the cause of the Confederacy as a whole. This lack of a cohesive, united front may have contributed to their ultimate defeat.
People like to say the Confederates lost because of divisions, but Lincoln faced as much divisions, if not more, than the Confederates during the war.
It is true that the Union also faced significant divisions during the war. The issue of slavery and secession was not supported by everyone in the North, and there were many political and social disagreements that threatened to tear the Union apart. However, it can also be argued that the Confederacy faced more internal divisions than the Union, which contributed to their ultimate defeat. The Confederacy was made up of individual states that were fiercely independent and often had their own agendas. The Confederate government struggled to maintain control over these states and often had difficulty getting them to work together towards a common goal. Additionally, the issue of state sovereignty meant the Confederacy had a weak central government, which made it difficult to coordinate military strategy and respond to the Union's advances. Ultimately, the combination of external pressure from the Union and internal divisions within the Confederacy contributed to their defeat.